the brown bits at the top, which is open defecation. And those show that although open defecation is declining, and it has declined from 28 to 21% in Africa, it is at a very slow rate. And the bottom part is the dark green part, which is the improved sanitation. And that is largely stagnant or progressing very slowly, and even in some sub-regions actually going back. Part of the story lies in this figure, which shows that that there has been progress, but progress has not kept up with increases in population. So the dark blue bar shows the increases in the population growth in terms of numbers of people, and the green bar shows the increase in access. So it tells the story. There have been substantial increases in access, but it has largely not kept up with population growth. I think one of the key messages is around the need to address inequalities and how we have not done very well at this. And later on, you will see that perhaps here is the potential secret in terms of how we can do much better in the SDG agenda. So this is a chart that shows if you move from left to right, it disaggregates at different levels the data to demonstrate how averages can mask inequality. So this is about open defecation, and just as an example, it's Mozambique, but this can be done for different parameters and different countries. So the African average for open defecation is 21%. And the different sub-regions, as you move to the right, has a spread. But if we then take the different countries within Africa, again you've got a spread between, for example, South Sudan, which is a relatively high level of open defecation, and Mauritius, which has largely eliminated this practice. And then if you take one country, and that's Mozambique, again you can see that there's a spread between all the different regions. And again, some regions are on par with South Sudan, and some regions are on par with Mauritius. So within one country, you have the whole diversity of Africa. And again, the spread between rural and urban. And then within rural and urban, you've got the spread between the wealthiest quintile and the poorest quintile. So if you look over to the right, you've got the rural population of Mozambique having a very similar spread, or in fact a wider spread in terms of open defecation as the whole of Africa. What it shows is that inequalities are real, they happen at many different levels, and that the averages don't tell you the story. Now this data shows you all the different countries and the spread between access to improved sanitation between the wealthiest quintile and the poorest quintile, and those in between. So the yellow dot is the wealthiest quintile, and it's on your right, and the darkest dot is the poorest, and it's on your left, and the others are in between. And you look at it horizontally for each country. And largely the story, and I think this is where we perhaps have a solution for the SDG period, because the story is that where a country has very low coverage overall, these are bunched up quite close together on the left-hand side. Sadly, as a country starts to improve, that spreads, which means the inequalities spread, and the yellow dot takes off to the right, which means that the wealthiest start getting access very quickly. And then it's only when the wealthiest reach a ceiling that the rest start catching up. So you can see many countries where there's a yellow lies in this, that if we can get the poorer quintile progressing as fast as the wealthiest quintile, then I think achieving the SDGs is very possible. So moving on to the Sustainable Development Goal targets. This is what's emerging. Many of your delegations are, and countries are negotiating these as we speak, so this is not by any means final, but this is the outcome of the Open Working Group. And what you can see that is that many of the parameters that the technical consultations facilitated by WHO and UNICEF under the Joint Monitoring Program have been adopted by member states. Of course, they have put it into their own language, quite rightly. So the principles of universality, of equity for all, so it's not just households, it's schools, it's health centers. Hygiene, something that was largely forgotten in the MDG agenda. Ending open defecation as an outcome in itself. Women and girls, and vulnerable situations, bringing in the humanitarian and fragile context. As you're aware from the experiences on Ebola as well as the sad events unfolding in Burundi, a lot of gains can very quickly be unraveled if the system is not resilient to dealing with these shocks. So I think we're in good hands in terms of the emerging and sustainable development agenda. And one thing that African countries can be proud of is the reference to affordability, which I think was very strongly championed by the African Union. So the basis on which Africa starts off for achieving the Sustainable Development Goal targets is not great, in the sense that progress to date on sanitation has not been as much as we would have hoped for. So only 8 countries has decreased open defecation by 20% since 1995. 20% is, from that period, is about a 1% per year decrease. So even that will not achieve the SDG targets, and only 8 countries have even achieved that threshold. So clearly, something has got to change. On hand washing, and we've only just started being able to measure hand washing at household level, so there's no longitudinal data. But we're starting from quite a low base. It does vary a little bit between regions, but even in North Africa and Southern Africa, we have some countries with high levels of hand washing with soap. You also have other countries within those sub-regions with very low levels. So there's a big spread, and we're starting from a low base, but we know that hand washing with soap is a very critical part of saving children's lives. So one of the concepts in the Sustainable Development Goal agenda that we can move on to is moving beyond the basic level of access to looking at sanitation as a system and looking at how countries are addressing that. So this is the sanitation value chain. So you contain the feces, you empty and transport it, you treat it, and then you dispose of it safely or you reuse it safely. That's the value chain. And at the moment, we only really, in terms of global monitoring, look at the containment part. We look at the infrastructure, we look at whether the feces is contained within a certain area, but we don't look at it beyond this. So in the Sustainable Development Goal period, what the Joint Monitoring Program and others, together with others, agencies in UN Water, is looking at, well, what happens to it afterwards. And a lot of things can happen to it. And this diagram, credit goes to the Water and Sanitation Program of the World Bank for developing this concept. But it relates how the system works beyond the containment. So how is it going in terms of empty? Is it safely empty? Is it unsafely empty? that it's only when the top quintile has reached quite a high level that they start looking at inequalities, or at least that inequalities start decreasing. So the one thought to leave you with is, if Africa is going to do this quicker, and in order to meet the SDGs, Africa will have to do this quicker than East Asia did it, then if we focus on the inequalities right from now, and manage to get that steep trend